Russia, a land of more than 8.5 million square miles, of more than 1/6 of the land area of the world. This is Russia, a land of more than 200 million people who speak 130 different languages. This is Russia, a land which ranges from the frozen tundra in the north to the high mountains of the Caucasus of the south, from the fertile black soil of the Ukraine to the arid deserts of Central Asia, a land whose temperatures range from 90 degrees below zero to 122 degrees above. These things we know about Russia. But what kind of people live in Russia? How do they live? Tonight we'll view that vast country through the eyes and the camera of one of our fellow Oklahomans in Report on Russia by Dick John.
Good evening, everyone. It was just a little over a month ago that a group of 29 Oklahoma farmers and ranchers left for a trip, an extensive tour of Soviet Russia. Dick John of our news staff made that trip, and just a week ago today came home. Dick, the actual itinerary of the trip was what?
Bob, actually, so far as Russia was concerned, we went from Helsinki to Leningrad, to Moscow, to Kiev, to Kharkov, to Sochi, and to Sukhumi. From there, we flew back to Moscow and then to Stockholm.
Some 25,000 miles, whole trip, wasn't it?
Oklahoma City to Oklahoma City.
A lot of questions that arise as the result of the observations a person can make on a lengthy trip like that. For instance, housing. How do the people in Russia live? We'll take a closer look at that after this message from Danny Williams. Dick, one of the first things that Oklahomans have asked is, how does the average Russian live? What is his home like?
Bob, actually, how the average Russian lives depends to a great extent on where he lives. In the city, there are no single-family houses, only apartment buildings, those by the thousands, and more of them going up all the time. Even in the brand-new buildings, up to 10 families share a bath, and as many as 5 people will occupy a 2-room apartment with the rooms 10 by 12 feet at best. Construction is very poor by our standards. Little or no steel is used. You see no paint of any kind, and the poured concrete starts to crumble on the ground floor before the top floor is finished.
Did you spend any time in typical Russian homes?
Actually, none at all, Bob. They pointed with a great deal of pride at their new apartment buildings as they built them, but they refused to allow us inside any apartments where people were actually living. What we learned about home life in Russia came through a number of very extensive conversations with our interpreters on the trip, all of whom lived in Moscow.
How about some examples?
Well, one particular example, which seems to me to be typical, one of our interpreters, a young woman by the name of Larissa, lived with her husband, her mother and father and brother in a Moscow 2-room apartment. They cooked on a hot plate, they had a sink with hot and cold running water, but they had to share a bath with occupants of 9 other apartments. The girl, her husband, and her father all work, and they're quite well-to-do by Moscow standards.
How about the situation on the Russian farms?
There are a great number of single-dwelling units on the farms. However, except for electricity, they're almost completely primitive. Thatched roofs with mud or adobe construction in the south, outdoor plumbing. The women cook on a wood stove. Generally, they're of one family size, and quite often the cattle and the sheep and even the poultry live in the same room with the family.
Russians have to get from one place to another. What do they use for transportation?
Very few private automobiles in Russia, Bob. Most of the transportation is public, and from what we were able to see, it's very efficient. Surface transportation, buses and trolleys, handle the big load in the cities, although the Russians had never seen a bus quite like the one that the government had supplied us during our stay. This one was made in Hungary, and at times it attracted crowds as large as the crowds who gaped at the strange Americans in their funny hats and boots. The buses and trolleys in common use are much older, but they have plenty of them, and they zip by every minute or so. The government is concerned, however, about the state of disrepair of thousands of miles of trolley tracks. The other chief form of public transportation in Moscow and Leningrad is the subway. They're rather new, the cars are large and well lighted, and the stations themselves are magnificently lighted and decorated with mosaic, statuary, and other artwork. They're reached by high-speed escalator and are some 200 feet below the ground. The Reds made it quite clear to us that they considered the Underground Railway a perfect bomb shelter as well if they ever need one.
What about railroads, those on top of the ground?
We traveled a good many 100 miles by rail, but we were prohibited from shooting pictures of any trains. In general, their trains are very old. Some of them are actually ancient, and some of the boxcars we saw must have been built before World War I. Passenger accommodations vary greatly. Now, the government provided us with a private car all the way, and it was very nice. Sleeps 4 to a compartment. But on the other hand, we saw people herded into other trains and other cars just like cattle. We had heard a great deal here at home about hard cars and soft cars in Russia. Ours was decidedly soft, of course, but we walked through 9 hard cars to and from the diner on one particular trip. A hard car has the general dimensions of one of our box cars and accommodates from 60 to 70 people. The beds are simply hard boards that drop down from the wall and from partitions that divide the car into quarters. Men and women, elderly people, and little tiny babies are all crowded into the same car where they stay for whatever's the length of their journey. People are stuck up all over the place, and it certainly took a fellow with a very inventive turn of mind to design such a car in the first place.
How about their air travel? Did you do any flying at all in Russia?
We did, several thousand miles, actually, before we were through. The Soviet Union has no 4-engine transports in general service. All of their civilian transports are either copies or very similar modifications to our DC-3s and Convairs. They are not pressurized. They also don't have safety belts, and when the pilot jumps up into the air, you can only hang on to the seat and pray.
Now, how about their private cars, their automobiles?
They're all copies, in some way, of American automobiles. The most common is a duplicate of our 1949 Plymouth, which you can see here. You can see them by the thousands, but almost all of them are owned by the government. There's no such thing as buying a car on time payment plan in Russia, and a low or medium-priced car costs more than most workers earn in an entire year. Other cars cost even more, but all are copies of American makes. In one particular case, a single car looks like it has parts from a 42 Buick, 42 Pontiac, and 42 Cadillac. For those who haven't the price of a car or truck, and that's the vast majority, there is an alternative, a push or pull cart, or for those with somewhat better resources, a horse or ox cart. You see them by the thousands from Leningrad on south, and most of the wagons have been built right at home. Some of the farms maintain excellent blacksmith shops and sawmills, which spend most of their time building wagons and the like for use on the farm. Generally speaking, they're all very well built. The only time I was forcibly restrained from taking a picture was on a farm down in Georgia when I started to shoot film of an ox cart traveling by the place where our farm manager was extending his welcome. The driver of the car had been shooed away in no uncertain terms at all. He obviously had missed the order of the day, which had been to detour around our area until the party was over. The Reds use a great many horses and oxen for transportation, but they seem to realize that we consider them a backward form of transportation, and they did their best to hide them. Fortunately, they were not entirely successful.
Well, Christianity, at the very least, would be a controversial subject in Soviet Russia. We'll get to that story in just a moment. Dick, we know that communism denies all religion, yet we hear that their churches in Russia are allowed to function. Is that really the case?
The Christian in Russia seems to have a better lot today than he has in years past, Bob, although religion as such is tolerated and nothing more by the government. There are churches, however. Leningrad has 14 churches with a population of 3.5 million people, and I might draw a parallel there. Oklahoma City, with a population of 250,000, has almost 100 Baptist churches alone.
How about the denominations you found?
Most of them were Russian Orthodox. There were a great many Baptist churches, and there were a few Jewish synagogues. Fact is, however, former cathedrals like St. Basil's on Red Square have been closed by the thousands throughout all of Russia. Many of them have been converted into museums or art galleries. At the Moscow Art Gallery, we were surprised to find a painting of Christ appearing to his followers. The Russians were not very inclined to discuss the painting, although they did seem to feel its presence showed their tolerance of religion, even though they claimed not to believe.
Did you actually attend any church services?
Yes, once. After the reception we received the first Sunday, however, our guides and interpreters managed to steer us clear of any more such church-going.
What happened then?
Well, one group attended a Russian Orthodox church. This was in Moscow. Another group attended a Baptist church service. At this Baptist service, 11 Oklahomans were seated up on the rostrum, and there must have been 2,000 or more Russians in the tiny building. All of them were standing, and they were jammed in there just like sardines. Their pastor explained who we were and where we lived, and then he asked if any of our group would care to say anything. Glenn Easterwood, who's a young rancher from out at Supply, walked up to the rostrum and pulled a Bible from his coat pocket. Through our interpreter, he told the Russians that while we lived in different worlds, we worshiped from the same book. The church Bible was also right there in front of Glenn. He extended our greetings to the congregation, and he told them that the prayers of all Americans were with them. Bob, the response there was hard to describe. They were mostly elderly people, and as we left, they sang, "God be with you till we meet again," the tune unmistakable, although the words were in Russian. All 2,000 of them at the same time waving white handkerchiefs, telling us goodbye, and the tears just coursing down their faces. Even our interpreter was in tears, and after that experience, they managed to bypass church services during the rest of our stay in Russia.
Has the government offered anything as a substitute for religion?
I think they may have offered several things. They may have made gods of a kind out of Lenin and perhaps even Stalin. They claim to believe in nothing but a materialistic world, but they seem to be making something of a cult out of culture. We visited more museums than I could count, this one in the Kremlin and the fanciest of the lot. And everywhere we saw long lines of people patiently awaiting their turn at a stroll through the art gallery or a museum, or waiting their turn to buy a ticket to the ballet. Sunday, which is our day of worship, is their big day, too, at the museums. And the crowds are so thick, it's often difficult to get around.
Was there anything of particular interest in their museums and art galleries?
Bob, now don't misunderstand me. For people educated in the arts and appreciative of them, many profitable hours, I'm sure, could be spent in the museums in Russia. The museum in Leningrad, for instance, the former Winter Palace of the Tsars, claimed to have 25 Rembrandts, although we did not see any of them. One other thing, in some of the museums and art galleries, we were forbidden to take pictures. And I've since been told, since we came back home, that some of the art treasures stolen by the Russians from West Europe in the hectic last days of World War II might have been in those museums, and thus the prohibition of any pictures. I mentioned the Kremlin Museum a second ago. It has, without any question, some of the most fabulous items you'll ever hope to see. Solid gold Easter eggs studded with precious stones. They were gifts to the Tsars of old given on Easter. Bridles, halters, saddles, and saddle blankets for the Tsars' horses. All of them studded with literally thousands of diamonds. And the huge boots which belonged to Peter the Great. He made them himself, and they must have been a size 16 at least, maybe even larger. He was a huge man. And the solid gold ice cream cone-shaped wine glass that Peter the Great served wine to his guests in. They had to drain it all before they could put it back down. There was no way to set it down with anything in it. Thousands of other silver and gold mementos of the ancient days of the Tsars, which certainly seem far removed today in Russia.
You mentioned the ballet. Did you see that while you were in Moscow?
We sure did, Bob, and it is really something to see. The staging, the music, and the dancing were all very close to perfection. Incidentally, one of our trips to the ballet coincided with a visit by Bulganin, Khrushchev, and Molotov, and the French premier Guy Mollet, who was in town on a state visit, you'll recall. It was one of the few times in Russia that we found that the Oklahoma farmers were not the prime attraction, and we lost the center of the stage that evening.
What about the field of consumer goods? Does Russia still have any shortages of various kinds of commodities or any rationing? Or do they have any choice in what they can buy and what they can't?
Bob, in many respects, you might compare the Russians to the Spartans of a good many years ago. Generally speaking, they have no rationing, but they don't have any kind of a choice of consumer products like we do, and they don't have the money to pay for them if they did have such a choice. The biggest department store in Russia is spelled G-U-M-S, and it's pronounced Gums. It's on Red Square right across from the Kremlin. It's 4 stories high, and it covers an entire city block. Inside are hundreds of small shops, each independent of the other, much like a public market right here at home. For sale are such items as clothing, food, tools, toilet articles, much like a department store in the United States. Instead of cash registers or adding machines, however, each shop has its own abacus, and they know how to use them. The store is connected by a maze of crosswalks, and you can see the entire length of the building. Outside are display windows, something like our stores at home, but they're rather drab by comparison. And all day long or all week, if you have that much time, you can watch the ordinary Russian woman window shop. But she doesn't buy anything, and the reason is very simple. She can't afford to shop for such luxuries as new clothing. And new clothing is a luxury over there, Bob. Prices don't mean anything. So let me put the cost of new clothes this way, in the percentage of an average worker's monthly salary, which is required for a specific article. A man's white shirt, 3 days' pay. A child's sailor suit takes 6 days' pay. A man's overcoat, 2 1/2 months' pay. A woman's sandal-type shoes, a half of a month's pay. High heels take 18 days' work. A woman's cotton house dress takes 2 weeks' pay. A 3 cubic foot refrigerator takes a full month of work. A 10-inch television set takes 2 months of work. An automobile tire takes 2 months' pay. Those prices make window shopping almost all Russians can afford. Two of our Oklahomans along on the trip did try some shopping at Goom's, however, without an interpreter, and they found some barriers other than the not-so-small matter of high prices.
How much is that in American money? How much American? How much money? How many rubles? How much is this?
15 рублей.
Huh? How many?
15 рублей.
Put it down on a piece of paper and see how much you can get for it. 15 rubles? 15? Well, let's see. Here. Those 5. How many of those? If that's 15 rubles, I'd like to buy it, or I want to get some change here anyway.
Галя, дай там еще поменьше.
Oh, here's a whole bunch of them. This is better. Now you can get the color you want. Okay, how much are these?
7 рублей. Да.
Oh, no, but how much?
Нет,
How many?
Карандашик дайте.
7 rubles for any of them?
No, this one and this one is.
Oh, which one is 7 rubles?
This one.
Oh, these are 7 rubles? Well, take it out.
Возьмите, платите, пожалуйста. Купить хотят.
How much is that?
Какую?
Those 5. Not 5. Okay, I want one of these. All right.
Нет, не так. А это убирайте. Одну?
Одна? Okay. Speaking very well. Oh, did you get one? No, I'm going to borrow yours. I'm going to... Huh? Don't you want one? No.
Дайте полубойдовый пакет.
I'll take that to my little granddaughter.
What about food and groceries, Dick? Do the Russians have any supermarkets as we know them?
Not hardly, Bob. Most of their food buying is done in open markets, which in a great many ways would compare with our farmers' markets here at home. Some food can be bought in department stores like Goom's or small bread shops in the cities, but the open market does most of the business. Here, the produce of the state and collective farms is sold, and the chief objection we found was a lack of cleanliness. Seems to be plenty of food, however, and such things as potatoes, beets, onions, and radishes are well within the reach of everybody's pocketbook.
How about meat?
It's sold right here in the market, too. It hangs out in the open where shoppers touch it and examine it by the dozens until somebody decides to buy. The fact that everybody else has handled the product doesn't seem to bother anyone. The Reds have very little refrigeration for their meat, so it's fresh killed and then sold as soon as possible.
Did you run across anything that would compare with an Oklahoma steak?
Bob, they don't know what one is. They kill the animal and then they simply chop it up into chunks of handy size. They only have 2 so-called cuts. They call it a first course and a second course. The first course is soup meat and bones, that sort of part of the animal that would go into soup. And all of the rest is the second course meat, which is boiled or baked or fried and served as a meat dish at a meal. The best they have isn't very good. They use all parts of an animal, too, and any meat counter worthy of the name will have at least 1 calf's head for sale. They eat a lot of poultry, but 99% of it seems to be duck. Chicken is very expensive. We priced one at $9 American money for a rather small fryer.
How about brand competition like we are experienced with?
They don't have any, Bob. In the food line, there are very few canned goods of any kind whatever. In other lines, for instance, there's one kind of hand soap. You find it from the north to the south in Russia. It lathers up real well, but it smells terrible. They have one kind of a fountain pen. It writes pretty well, but just the one kind. They have one kind of a toothpaste. There's one kind of gasoline that you can put in your automobile. And incidentally, we counted only a total of 3 filling stations during the whole trip through Russia.
The Russian woman should give us material to talk about for quite a bit. We'll do just that in just a moment. has to be more than any other. How does the average Russian woman compare with the American woman?
Bob, let me tell you and the ladies, there's no comparison at all. Over in Russia, the women are doing probably 90% of the manual labor. They're muscular women, they're heavy-set, and they're certainly most unattractive by our standards here at home. I've had a lot of people ask me about their health. They seemed healthy enough to me, except for one item. Russia seems to be a nation of poor teeth. Men and women alike seem to be afflicted, and complete dentures are very common at an early age. Fortunately for them, the government pulls teeth for free, and a set of dentures is quite cheap.
We hear that Russian women are subsidized for bearing children. Is that true?
Yes, it is. The government starts the subsidy at 3 children and scales it upward as the number increases. At 10 children, Mama is decorated with a medal and the title of Hero Mother. And most important, she is given lifetime pension of 1,000 rubles a month. As I said, women do almost all of the manual labor, but they're touchy about having their picture taken while at work. They seem to realize that such a sight struck us as being odd, and they seem to be embarrassed about it. Thousands of them are employed by the state as street sweepers. They use twig brooms, which they cut each spring and then tie to the broom handle. We didn't see any other kind of broom anywhere in Russia.
With religion officially discredited, how do the Russians go about getting married, or if they have to, divorced?
Well, the couple simply reports to a government office, Bob. They fill out a form and they're pronounced married. It's very simple, and it's a rather drab thing. If they want a divorce, they check back in at that same office and get their divorce. However, they have a new law which very soon will make a court petition necessary for a divorce.
While you're over there, didn't you see any attractive women at all?
There are some attractive women in the ballet, but outside the theater, we saw only 3 women. You might call them girls that could be called pretty. One was a 13 or 14-year-old girl named Kiev, who was blonde and blue-eyed, and she'll be a beautiful woman if she doesn't end up on the business end of a shovel. Kiev was occupied by the Germans for 3 years, and there are many such indications of that occupation. Another aftermath of the war is the high ratio of women to men. In some areas, the shortage of men is acute, and it's rare indeed the woman who has a husband.
You mentioned one of those attractive girls. How about the others?
Bob, one of the others was a young girl who worked as a milkmaid on one of the Collectis farms. There she is right now. She was completely unaffected, and she was almost overwhelmed at the attention she received from the visiting Americans. Everybody who had a camera took her picture, and that included Roy Stewart down at the Daily Oklahoman and myself. Roy gave her a plastic rain hat, and she acted like she'd been given the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
And your overall impression of Russian women would be?
Well, as a Russian actress was quoted as saying in Time magazine this past week, there's no room for sex appeal in Russia, and she certainly knew what she was talking about.
Well, getting to education and schools, what is the situation in that area?
Education and what they're doing in that field was the one thing that probably disturbed us in some ways more than any other, Bob. The Russians seem to be going all out to raise the general level of education to at least a par with ours and to exceed us if they possibly can. The man with the best education is the man who makes the most money in the Soviet Union, and he's the same fellow who occupies the most honored place in their society, and that, of course, isn't the way it is in many cases here at home. The basic school system in Russia is this: 10 years of schooling starting at age 7, a 6-day week, 2-month summer vacation. The teacher-pupil ratio appears to be very good. It was 20-to-1 at this particular school. Teachers here were all women, and there was no corporal punishment. If a student starts slipping, his fellow students are assigned to help him over the hump, and the youngsters appear to be very happy and extremely well-disciplined. For the younger children, the state operates nurseries and kindergartens, and many children spend the better part of their entire lives, from cradle to adulthood, under the direct supervision of the state. 2 foreign languages are required during the basic schooling period. German and English seem to be the most popular, and in one class in this school, we were welcomed in halting English by students in the English class.
About their higher education, their colleges and universities?
33 universities, they say, in the Soviet Union. By far the biggest is Moscow University. It has 22,000 rooms and almost as many students. It's quite an imposing series of buildings, and the Reds are quite proud of it. There are a number of students there, Bob, from North Korea, Red China, and from the satellite nations in Eastern Europe. There's no horseplay among those students, and I doubt very seriously whether they ever heard of a panty raid.
How about their outlying areas away from Moscow, for instance? Do they have their own colleges there?
They say that each of the 16 republics has at least one university or college of its own.
How about the adult education? Libraries or facilities of that sort?
The bigger cities seem to have some fine libraries. Leningrad has a library which boasts 12 million volumes. Moscow has the recently opened Lenin Memorial Library, which claims over 20 million volumes.
In that area.
Overall, Bob, the Russian seems to me, and seems to all of us, to be a very good farmer. What he lacks in mechanization, he certainly makes up in numbers, and also in the ability to do some real hard work. There are no frills. The people over there live a very rough and at sometimes difficult life, but everywhere we went, they seemed genuinely glad to see us. There are three basic units in the Soviet agricultural scheme of things. They are the collective farm, the state farm, and the farm machinery tractor station. Briefly, here's how they're set up. The collective farm is operated almost entirely by the people who live upon it and work upon it. It's a co-op, and its management is elected by the workers, and they claim that any time they don't like the way things are going, they can fire the boss and elect a new one. The workers are paid in part through a straight salary and in part through a share of the farm's proceeds. Through extra work and through particularly good harvests, the workers actually share in the farm's profits over and above that base salary. The state farm is owned and operated outright by the government. Base salaries are a little bit better here, but the workers do not share in the profits or the harvest. All research work, which is always unprofitable wherever you conduct it, is conducted on the state farm in Russia. The farm machinery tractor station is also operated entirely by the government, and it provides the farm machinery which is needed on surrounding farms. One such station will handle all of the plowing, combining, and such for as many as 12 farms. The station is paid on a percentage basis, but not to exceed 10% of the crop harvested. Under such a setup, each individual farm owns only a bare minimum of machinery.
How big are their farms, Dick?
They vary, but most of them seem to average between 10 and 16,000 acres. In Russia, with all of that land, even a 16,000-acre farm doesn't seem to be very big. Down in the Ukraine, what the Reds call their breadbasket, you can travel for hundreds of miles without seeing a single fence, and all of it is under cultivation.
About that Ukraine, we've heard reports of a severe wheat loss this year. Was there any evidence of that?
We saw some evidence of it, Bob. I couldn't say how widespread the loss was, as there was a lot of the Ukraine we didn't visit. But in the northeast third, where we were, it looked like the entire winter wheat crop was gone. The Russians had a late spring this year, and general rains combined with an unusually late hard freeze to winter kill their entire crop. They hedged at first when we asked them about it. They seemed unable to admit either their shortcomings or their hard luck. But there just wasn't any wheat left, and when they saw that we were well aware of the fact, they went ahead and told us the story. It was quite a blow to them, as it would have been to any farmer, Russian, American, or what have you.
Were they interested in any of our techniques of farming?
They sure were. They wanted to know all about the way we raise our crops, livestock, and take care of our machinery. Most of what we told them was immediately written down, too, apparently for future reference. However, when we tried to tell them how a farmer with one hired hand and modern machinery could work 2,000 acres or more of land over here, they laughed at us. They just wouldn't believe it at all.
How many people work on the average collective farm there?
One farm down near the Black Sea employs 11,000 workers to work 13,000 acres. So it wasn't hard to see why they didn't believe our stories.
Would their machinery compare with ours?
One of the Oklahomans on the tour commented along the way that the combines and tractors that the Russians are now using wouldn't be worth hauling to a farm sale back here at home. And most of the people on the tour seem to feel the same way about it. The backbone of their farm operation is still horses, cattle, and oxen, although they would move them to another location at almost every farm we visited. They couldn't move them all, and we saw enough of them. Besides, if you asked, they were glad to tell you how many hundred horses and oxen the farm used. They just seemed to be coy or shy for some reason about having to take pictures of them.
How about the farm equipment, American equipment? Do they have any of ours, or does theirs look like it's been copied from ours like their automobiles do?
It seems that the backbone of their tractor system is a carbon copy of our 1929 Farmall. Back in 1928, a group of American industrialists visited Russia at their invitation to help them set up a production line and start building tractors. Once the job was finished, the Americans came back home and forgot about it, but the Russians are still building that same tractor almost 30 years later. We visited a tractor plant and were asked to leave our cameras at the hotel. Apparently they didn't want us filming their production line. At any rate, whatever the reason, I'm afraid we wouldn't have seen much that would have been much value to the folks who make tractors today here in the United States.
Is that the only tractor they have?
No, it isn't, Bob. They've developed, at least partially on their own, several other models which they also manufacture. They're using the tank-type Caterpillar tread on most of them, and they seem to function pretty well. Each driver is his own mechanic, and most of them only seem to be fair to middling mechanics at best. As a result, they have a large number of breakdowns and a great deal of maintenance to perform.
How about research in the field of agriculture?
Well, for one thing, the Russians have come up with a breed of cattle that seems to suit their needs almost to a T. They call it a Semutol, S-E-M-U-T-O-L. It's as big as a mountain. Actually, its back is as high as the top of my head. It weighs up to 1,800 pounds, almost a ton or better. It's a combination beef and milk animal, Bob, and while it wouldn't be worth very much over here, it seems to be the answer to their problem. It produces a lot of milk and a lot of meat. You don't care particularly how beef tastes, whether it's tender, and the Russians certainly do not care, then the Semutol could be for you. The Russians are also working on bigger and better breeds of swine. They built an excellent hog barn, and the pigs were much better than we had expected. We were told that during the German invasion, almost all of their livestock was destroyed. Now, if that's true, and it very likely is, since the area around Kyiv and Kharkov was fought over between the Russians and Germans for a period of better than 3 years, they have made a great deal of progress in the field of livestock in the past few years.
Does the government own all of the land, or can an individual buy some for his very own?
No, the state still owns it all, although they have relaxed somewhat in one way. Individuals can ask for and obtain up to 2.5 acres of land on a long-term lease basis from the government for their own use. Most city residents who take the land try to build a summer cottage on it. They'll also have a small garden patch, but farm residents plow and plant every square inch of it, and then they can either sell the produce in the open markets or they can use it in their own home, however they wish.
How about some of the other after effects from the war on the farms?
Well, many of them, particularly around Kyiv and Kharkov, and this film right here, incidentally, was taken just outside of Kharkov at a tea farm. Many of the farms were wiped out during the German invasion. This is one of them. This farm was turned into a concentration camp, and when the Germans were about to lose the area for the last time, the last 900 men in the camp were lined up and shot to death. They're buried in a huge common grave on the farm, which is topped by that statue of a Russian soldier. And all around the memorial is an apple orchard. After the Germans left, the place once again was turned into a farm.
The Russians the world over are known for the kind of parties they give. We're going to take a peek at one or two in just a moment. Dick, since you've gotten back, we've heard an awful lot about the banquets and the parties that the Russians threw for you at all those farms you stopped at.
They were really something, Bob. Each farm has a dining hall of its own, which apparently is used to entertain visiting dignitaries and the like. They'd load the tables down with food, and all of the officials at the farm would join us around the festive board, and we would really have a ball.
How about all this toasting and vodka?
Well, what you heard about it, it's all true. There are 3 glasses at each place setting, one for wine, one for beer, and one for vodka. You have to kind of watch your step because there's somebody at your elbow all the time ready to fill up a glass whenever it gets empty.
The toast, what was the subject for the toast?
They were pretty much what you would expect. Toast to friendship between the Soviet Union and the United States, to good harvest for all of us, to peace in the world, and so forth. Roy Stewart, who acted as our spokesman, he did a wonderful job. He phrased all of these toasts to avoid giving them anything that they could twist into just another piece of propaganda.
Нас почти полностью породило, или точнее даже полностью мы поддержаны тем гостеприимством, который мы нам оказаны. With those who live on the land and who live near the land and love the land, there is always a very common ground of understanding. Те, кто живут на земле или живут и работают неподалеку от земли, те, кто трудится на земле, у тех есть одно общее основание, общий фундамент для взаимопонимания. We come as friends, we were received as friends, and we feel that among us here there is no barrier except that of language.
How about the entertainment at some of these parties, Dick?
They didn't miss a bet, Bob. They like to sing and they dance, and they do both very well. We did a little bit of singing also, but I'm afraid we needed considerably more practice at the time.
You said something about the Russians singing and dancing and doing both well.
All of their songs, Bob, are in a minor key, and so as a result, even the ones that are supposed to be funny have kind of a sad song, a sad sound to those of us from America. As a result, they're all in a very minor key, but there's one thing for sure, they sure know the words a lot better than we do.
How about their dancing?
At our last party, Bob, a man and woman came in to entertain us after the banquet. They were very good, even on the tiny floor with very poor light and the rain just pouring down outside. The dance had hardly ended when Fred Drummond from Pawhuska, a crackerjack square dancer, decided to take a crack at their folk dance. What resulted, especially when the Russian woman's original partner cut in on Drummond, was really something to see.
Time was had by all.
That's right, and they all parted friends.
With all the hard work and the high prices that they have, do they have any time for this just themselves and recreation and play?
Bob, actually, they have a surprising amount of time off over there, much more than we thought. The average Russian, during the year, he does pretty much the same sort of thing we Americans do. On his weekend or after work, he'll take a walk in the park, he'll visit an art gallery or a museum, or he might even go to a movie, although they're so bad that even the Russians don't care too much for them. The Russian is also an avid sports fan. He has soccer instead of football, and this stadium on the Baltic at Leningrad will hold over 100,000 fans. The Russians are also great followers of individual sports, especially track, and every stadium has an excellent cinder track and spacious infield for the javelin throw and the like. Each town has its own circus, and incidentally, the one in Moscow has a magician who is absolutely out of this world. Now, once each year, the Russian gets a vacation, or rest as he prefers to call it. They consider the term vacation strictly for capitalists. The lucky ones try to reach the Black Sea area to the south, where Russia appears to be attempting to build another sort of poor man's Riviera. For mile after mile along the coast, huge rest homes and sanatoriums are under construction by one government, trade union, or another for use by tired workers during their summer vacation. And incidentally, they all get 1 month off each year, which did seem to us to be very liberal indeed.
How can the average worker afford this rest or vacation?
Actually, he cannot, Bob, and very few ever spend any time down there on the Black Sea. But the trade unions have built some very plush resorts at Sochi and Sukhumi, and if a worker can finagle away at all, he's going to get down there. Also, if he can come up with a first-class case of the nerves and convince the doctor up in Moscow, the union will send him down there for a rest, all expenses paid.
How about hunting and fishing?
Well, they can hunt and they can fish, but not very many of them do. Hunting is permissible, and many Reds own rifles or shotguns. Their conservation laws are rather practical, too. For instance, if you'd like to go elk hunting, it's fine, but first you must produce the scalps of 2 timber wolves. In exchange for them, you get your elk permit. As for fishing, there's plenty of water, especially down here in the south, but not many people seem to care anything about it. Both on the Black Sea and in the Caucasus, there in the background, we saw a fishing country that apparently had never even been touched. Nobody seems to care anything about fishing for trout in the mountain streams or deep sea fishing for pure sport. Of course, there is plenty of commercial fishing vessels plying the coastal areas around the Black Sea. I might tell you about one time we asked about hiring a boat for a fishing party on the Black Sea. Nobody seemed to understand or be able to comprehend that we would like to pay money for a boat just to go out and fish for the pure fun of it on a Sunday afternoon. Finally, we had to give it up. We went for a walk.
How about the mountains? They look quite picturesque.
Caucasus are beautiful mountains, all right, and they're filled with clear mountain streams. The Russians indicated to us that they're planning to turn the mountains into quite a resort area also, and they've made quite a start in that direction. This is a picture of the mountains taken over Lake Ritsa in the Caucasus. The Russians told us that you haven't seen the Caucasus if you haven't seen Lake Ritsa. Well, we've seen Lake Ritsa. It wasn't a very fancy place, but it seems to be a step in the right direction.
Dick, what does the Russian like when it's for after-hours entertainment in nightclubs and so on?
Bob, very little nightlife in the cities except in the bigger hotels. Dance band at the Metropole and the National in Moscow, of course. But otherwise, very little nightlife. No nightclubs as we would understand them. But down in the resort areas on the Black Sea, it's a different story entirely. At one hotel on the Black Sea, we ate and some of us danced to a Russian swing band that was well equipped with American tunes, although they were at least 10 years old. The government officially frowns on such goings-on, or so we were told, but nobody seemed to mind in the least.
Just a few months ago, the Russians started to tear down the great myth that they built about Joseph Stalin. We'll talk a little bit more about this de-Stalinization in just a moment. Dick, how do the Russians feel, how they're reacting to this de-glorification of Joe Stalin?
Well, Bob, there are plenty of statues, paintings, and the like of Stalin still around. And if they've been tearing very many of them down, there must have been a million of them to begin with. Particularly down in Georgia, which was Stalin's home, there are a great many reminders. The Georgians are an independent lot, and they must not like what the Kremlin's been saying about their former leader. I asked one young fellow in Georgia if he was a Russian. He jabbed his chest with his forefinger and said, "I'm a Georgian."
Did you visit Stalin and Lenin's tomb when you were in Moscow?
Yes, we did. It's a beautiful granite and marble building on Red Square, and every day a line up to 1.5 miles long, 4 abreast, forms right outside. Thousands of Russians spend the entire day waiting just to spend a couple of minutes viewing the two bodies.
What was the appearance of the bodies?
Stalin looks perfectly natural, so does Lenin, although after 32 years there are some slight signs of what might be deterioration in his body. Both are kept in slightly raised glass wall crypts, and both are bathed in a reddish light from above. There's an honor guard of Red Army soldiers at the entrance and stationed along the walls down into the tomb. This is one place you don't take a camera, at least not if they know you have one. The tomb is about 2 stories underground, and directly in back of the building itself, in the huge red brick wall which surrounds the Kremlin, other lesser luminaries in recent years in Soviet Russia have been buried. Andrei Vyshinsky is buried in the wall there. The tomb is a striking place, Bob, and visiting it was quite an experience for me. The average Muscovite seems to regard Lenin and perhaps even Stalin as a god. They're invariably weeping as they walk back out into the sunlight. There are 1,000,001 impressions in your mind after you pay a visit to the place, but the one that seems to stick in my memory is the memory of that long, long line of silent, ragged Russians, just as patient as they can be, waiting to walk by Lenin or Stalin, or at least all they have left of them.
Well, Dick, for some first-hand observations, how does the Russian feel toward the United States?
Seems to be friendly, basically. He knows very little about us, Bob, and he wants very much to know more. They say, however, that we're on our decline and that capitalism is on the way out and must have war to exist.
Do they act like they want war?
No, not at all. The ordinary people certainly don't want any war. In all predictions of their future progress, they preface it with the statement that providing there is no war. That's the way they put it.
How do they feel about our government and some of our personalities here in the United States?
They seem to be, the ones I talked with, seem to be quite fond of President Eisenhower. They don't like Secretary of State John Foster Dulles at all. They make some rather coarse jokes about him, and yet they can't explain why they don't like him. I never could quite understand that. They hate Senator Joseph McCarthy. They say that they cannot understand what caused him to occupy what they termed a very important place in this country for so long.
Do they have any ways that they justify the spread of communism, the expansion of their ideology in the world?
No, they don't even try to justify it. Sometimes they'll change the subject if they can, but if they can't, they won't even try. They say that they don't want any war, but they say that it is their duty as communists in the world to try to change us to communism, just like it's their duty to try to swing the rest of the world in that direction.
How about a communist in your personal contacts with some real communists? There are not many of them, I understand, in proportion to the population.
6 million of them, Bob, in a land of 200 million. Pardon me. And they struck me as an exclusive social club rather than a political party. They have high moral standards. You must be approved. You must be very capable in your work. It was very much like getting into a very exclusive club over here, or so they say.
Mm-hmm. How about their security checks that you and the others had to go through, customs inspections and things like that?
Surprising as it was to us, we didn't have any customs inspection going into Russia. They asked us some questions about money, how much we had going in and coming out, but they never opened our bags. I would like to say that that was quite a change from New York City. I thought I was going to spend a week in New York before I got through, and with a little help, I got through in a little bit less time than that.
Well, you know, some of the film you sent back took 11 days to go from Scandinavia to the United States. About 8 or 9 days of that was consumed in customs inspection in the nearest customs office here in the United States. How about dogs over there? I noticed that you were talking.
There aren't any dogs. There
Really?
aren't any dogs. I don't know what's happened to them, but we didn't see half a dozen dogs during the whole trip. Most of those were purebreds, boxers, German shepherds, and the like.
They don't have any domestic pets?
There isn't a stray. There isn't a stray on the streets. What happened to them, I don't know.
Very quickly, what would be an average breakfast or lunch or supper or something like that?
It would always start with cucumbers. Most of the time, it would also have caviar. It would include clabbered milk. It would include mineral water, naturally carbonated as it bubbles out of the rocks, black bread, raw fish.
For breakfast, wasn't it?
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner sometimes. I paid $1.25 for a lemon 30 miles from where it was grown.
Nick, if you had one thought or impression as a result of this whole trip, what would it be?
The only thing that I came back with, Bob, is the abject ignorance on their part of the United States, and actually, to a great degree, ignorance on our part of Russia. If there was anything that struck me, it would be the seeming, to just a layman, the seeming need for a greater exchange of visitations between the two countries. Certainly a greater need for understanding. No matter where we go, understanding can't hurt either one of us. And they are hungry for information about the United States. I have several of them that I'm going to write and send such information. And I think that there are a lot of people over here that could learn a lot from visiting over there, information-wise.
They expressed an interest of getting to the United States?
They'd love to.